Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very relatable. Sleep, or more accurately, how medieval people slept, which turns out to be far weirder than most of us could imagine. Picture this. It's dark, there's no soft mattress, no white noise machine, and your neighbors might include a pig or two. If you're lucky, you'll make it through the night without being bitten by a flea or woken up by the unmistakable sound of livestock scratching around. You probably won't survive this if you're used to your cozy bed. But you've got to admit, there's something fascinating about stepping into the past. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see where in the world we're connecting tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the medieval world, sleep was as much about survival as it was about rest. There was no such thing as a comfortable, uninterrupted night's sleep. Instead, people followed a routine known as segmented sleep, and it was vastly different from what you or I would ever expect. The concept of a good night's sleep didn't quite exist. And while today we're obsessed with sleep cycles and getting 8 uninterrupted hours of shut-eye, people in the Middle Ages were thriving, or at least making do, with something much stranger. When the sun went down, most people went to bed relatively early. If you were a farmer, a monk, or pretty much anyone in medieval Europe, chances are you didn't have the luxury of late-night Netflix binges or all-night parties. You probably fell asleep in a cold, uncomfortable environment after a long day of hard work. But here's the twist. About 4 hours into sleep, most people didn't stay asleep. They woke up intentionally. This wasn't insomnia. This was how sleep worked. People would wake up in the middle of the night, probably to the sound of someone snoring or a rat scurrying across the floor. It was a practical time, a quiet, dark window where people could tend to chores, pray, or simply hang out. In fact, medieval people used this watch time for some of the most important parts of their lives. Remember, there were no light pollution, no distractions. It was a time to reflect, pray, read, and even engage in intimate moments with their partner. Because really, nothing says romance like a late-night snack of bread and cheese and a quiet hour in the dark. People might light a candle, pray, and even check on their animals, because heaven forbid your goat had gotten loose and caused chaos in the yard. If you were a bit luckier, you may have been able to snag a quick moment of quiet intimacy. Historians still argue whether this segmented sleep cycle was actually more in tune with the body's natural circadian rhythms, but it's clear that people in medieval times thought of it as the normal way to sleep. And let's face it, they didn't exactly have the luxury of sleep technology. It wasn't about perfection. It was about what worked. Imagine waking up in the dead of night, not tossing and turning in anxiety, but getting up and doing something useful or meaningful, and then simply falling back into a deeper sleep. This was no mere accident. It was a practical, deeply embedded part of life. The second sleep came after this interlude. It was a deep rest, meant to carry you through the rest of the night until sunrise. Everyone was awake and ready to face another long day by the time dawn arrived, only to repeat the cycle again. This was how people managed to keep up with the demands of medieval life. Waking up in the middle of the night wasn't a failure of their sleep routine. It was just how things were done. Imagine if today you woke up in the middle of the night and didn't grab your phone or lie there in frustration. Instead, you got up, maybe checked on your animals or took some time to pray or meditate. There's something oddly soothing about the idea, isn't there? Instead of fighting against your body's natural rhythms, you simply followed them. But let's not get too romantic about it. As fascinating as this practice was, there were some drawbacks to this segmented sleep routine. The first problem was that this whole cycle was dependent on natural light. So, the minute the sun came up, everyone was awake, and the daylight hours were packed with work. This might sound like a nightmare for some, having to be up and about before the sun rises. But remember, medieval times weren't exactly known for long, lazy mornings. You had to make the most of every daylight hour you could. In the modern world, we've got electric lights, late-night apps, and the expectation of 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. But in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just the quality of sleep that was different. It was the rhythm and the rituals that surrounded it. If you could have your medieval sleep cycle today, would you embrace it? Would waking up for midnight prayers, checking on your animals, and spending time with loved ones feel more natural than fighting off a restless mind, hoping for a few more hours of sleep? It's hard to say. But one thing's for sure. Our ancestors had a rhythm to their sleep that was tied to their environment, their needs, and their very survival. And perhaps there's a lesson in that. Maybe we should stop fighting our own natural rhythms and start embracing the rhythms of our own lives. You're still adjusting to the rhythm of this medieval sleep cycle. The sound of distant farm animals, the crackling fire, and the hum of whispered prayers all come to life in your mind. It's almost like you've stepped into another world, one where night isn't just about sleep, but about reflection, work, and even intimacy. But before you get too comfortable with this idea, let's dig deeper into how this sleep cycle actually worked in practice. You've got to realize, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't as cozy as it sounds. After what people called first sleep, which was usually about 4 hours long, you woke up to the cold, eerie stillness of the darkened night. While today, modern life makes it easy to simply roll over and wait for the next sleep cycle, the medieval night offered few comforts. There was no warm blanket of safety to crawl under, or the soft hum of an electric fan to help you drift back to sleep. Instead, you would be met by a chill in the air, the faint smell of wood smoke from the fire, and perhaps the occasional snore from the person beside you. But here's where things start to get interesting. This middle-of-the-night wake-up wasn't seen as an inconvenience or an oddity. It was a time for action, or what we'd now call productive procrastination. People would get out of bed and tend to all sorts of activities. It wasn't just about lying there with your thoughts. Oh no. In fact, if you had a fire, you might stoke it or prepare the hearth for the morning's needs. If you lived on a farm, well, checking on livestock was another common task, especially to make sure that no rogue goats were sneaking out of the pen. Imagine waking up at 2 a.m. to check on your cow. Seems strange, right? Yet, it was totally normal for medieval people. If you were lucky, you might take this time for prayer, quietly reflecting on your day and contemplating what might happen to your soul. The idea was that the mind was calm, the body rested, and thus you were at your most spiritually available during that time. This wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. As crazy as it seems, the middle of the night, the time that we now associate with tiredness, was thought of as the optimal time for reflection, contemplation, and sometimes even prayer. And let's not forget intimacy. In a world where privacy was a luxury reserved for the rich, this watch period offered couples an unusual opportunity for quiet, shared moments of closeness. You can picture it now. After hours of grueling farm work, waking up in the stillness of the night and sharing a quiet moment with your partner before drifting back into sleep. Sure, it might not be the romantic ideal of candlelit dinners or starry nights, but for medieval folk, this interlude was often just as meaningful as a day at the market. You may be wondering how people had time for this, with all of their duties during the day. Well, let me tell you that the days were long, and sleep wasn't the priority that it often is today. In fact, historians still argue whether this segmented sleep was actually a more natural cycle for the body. It's true that our bodies are attuned to the rise and fall of the sun, with circadian rhythms that encourage a split sleep cycle. Some modern research suggests that perhaps we've been getting sleep all wrong. Could it be that we've grown too accustomed to the idea of a full, uninterrupted sleep cycle? Perhaps the medieval way was more in tune with our natural rhythms. Something to ponder when you're staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m., wondering if you'll ever fall back asleep. But let's talk about a major drawback of this segmented sleep cycle: the lack of comfort. If you think about how you sleep today, cozy blankets, a soft mattress, and a quiet, controlled environment, it's hard to imagine how people could sleep in a world without any of these modern luxuries. The beds were, well, let's just say they weren't what you might call comfortable. A medieval bed was often just a thin pile of straw or hay stuffed into a sack of rough fabric. Even if you were lucky enough to have a mattress, it wasn't filled with the luxurious foam or down feathers we're accustomed to today. Straw mattresses were common, and if you didn't have the luxury of a proper mattress, you just slept directly on the straw, cold, hard, and full of bugs. That's right, bugs. Lice, fleas, and other creepy crawlies were practically roommates for medieval peasants. If you didn't have a mattress, it was likely infested with all sorts of unwelcome guests. You were essentially sharing your bed with whatever decided to make it home for the night. And if you did have a mattress, it wasn't much better. Even wealthy families didn't escape the nightly discomforts of bed bugs. So, while the middle of the night might have been a time for reflection and prayer, it was also a time to scratch, shift, and deal with the constant discomfort of living with pests. So, how did people handle all this discomfort? Surprisingly, some even found ways to make peace with it. They lived in a state of perpetual discomfort, but learned to adapt. The hay mattresses, the cold, the rats. It became a way of life. The entire environment was built on making do with whatever resources you had. No mattress? Make do with some straw. No privacy. Sleep with your entire family, or a neighbor, or a random traveler at the local inn. But it wasn't just peasants who dealt with this reality. Even royalty had their share of discomforts. While the rich did have larger, more ornate beds, they weren't immune to the discomforts of the time. Their beds may have been made of wood, with fine linen sheets, but the lack of proper heating meant cold drafts that seeped in through stone walls. And even their beds weren't safe from the occasional mouse or flea. Life was hard for everyone, in different ways. In fact, the main difference between the wealthy and the poor was simply that the rich could afford slightly less miserable conditions. Nothing more, nothing less. Now that you've gotten a taste of how medieval people lived, you're probably wondering, how did they survive it all? With all the discomfort, the cold stone walls, the fleas, and the shared beds, it must have been hard to get a decent night's sleep, right? Well, you're right. Medieval sleep was far from ideal, but the people of that time adapted in ways that may seem strange, even hilarious, to us today. Let's take a closer look at one of the most bizarre aspects of medieval sleep: the nightcap. You've probably heard of a nightcap before, but the medieval version wasn't a drink you sipped before bed. It was a hat. Yes, a literal hat. And it wasn't just some cute accessory to complete the medieval look. No, this was a functional piece of headgear designed to keep your head from freezing off while you slept. You see, medieval homes didn't exactly have what you'd call central heating. In fact, the heating system was often little more than a fireplace or a small stove that barely did the trick in the dead of winter. Stone walls, thatched roofs, and thin animal horn windows didn't help much either. So, if you wanted to survive a night in the medieval cold, you had to get creative. Enter the nightcap, a long, often ridiculous-looking piece of fabric that covered your head while you slept. These nightcaps weren't just for warmth, either. They also had social significance. In some regions, married women were expected to wear them at all times, even while they slept. And, depending on the quality of the fabric, the style and color of your nightcap could tell others a lot about your social status. You could walk into a room and immediately identify someone's wealth based on their nightcap, which is probably the weirdest form of social signaling you could imagine. It was like a medieval version of a designer brand. Want to look rich? Wear a fancy nightcap. Historians still argue whether the nightcap was purely for warmth or whether it also had a spiritual or modesty-based role. Some believe it helped maintain modesty, particularly for women, while others argue it was more about keeping your head warm in the freezing cold. Regardless of the reason, one thing's for sure: these hats weren't exactly stylish, but they were essential. The medieval nightcap wasn't the only odd accessory people used for warmth either. In fact, if you look at medieval sleep from a modern perspective, you might think everyone was just constantly freezing. But these people didn't have the luxury of thick, puffy winter coats or insulated sleeping bags. Instead, they relied on layers upon layers of clothing. And when I say layers, I'm talking about multiple tunics, often worn on top of each other. Think of it like medieval version of a sleeping bag. If a sleeping bag was made out of wool and smelled like livestock. Even the wealthy, despite their grand beds and fine sheets, still had to contend with the cold. Sure, they had bigger, more comfortable sleeping arrangements, but they didn't exactly have an electric blanket to keep them warm at night. And remember, Medieval homes had no indoor plumbing, so that drafty room you're picturing, it was very real. Every night, people bundled up as best they could, hoping that they wouldn't wake up in the middle of the night with a frozen nose, or worse, a frozen soul. Now, before we dive deeper into the strange rituals of medieval sleep, let's talk about something even stranger: sleeping with livestock. Imagine sharing a bed with a pig. Sounds like a nightmare, right? But for medieval peasants, this was a common reality. People lived in single-room homes where the kitchen, living space, and sleeping area were all combined. The same room you ate, cooked, and worked in also served as your bedroom. And if you were lucky enough to own a cow, goat, or pig, there was a good chance you shared that bed with them too. The reason? Warmth. You see, animals generate body heat, and in a world where central heating didn't exist, having a warm body in your bed, whether human or animal, was a matter of survival. The livestock wasn't just there for companionship. They were there to help you stay alive during the cold winter months. A cow or a pig might raise the temperature in the room by a few degrees, which in January felt like a miracle. But it wasn't always as cozy as it sounds. Animals are messy, noisy, and downright uncooperative when it comes to sharing a bed. Sure, a large dog could keep your feet warm, but a goat? Not so much. And yet, people learned to adapt. They slept with livestock not out of preference, but out of necessity. And it wasn't just in the winter. If you lived in a rural area, there were no barns or separate stables for your animals. The animals and humans coexisted in the same confined space, side by side. Sure, you might wake up with a hoof in your face, but at least you'd have made it through the night. And if that hoof was too much to handle, well, there was always the smell of manure to distract you. This close relationship between people and their animals was more than just practical. It was also spiritual. In many cases, animals were considered sacred, and their presence in the home was thought to offer divine protection. After all, who needs an angel when you've got a pig keeping you warm at night? Animals weren't just a source of warmth and food. They were part of the family, playing a central role in the spiritual and social fabric of medieval life. Historians still argue about whether sleeping with livestock was the result of necessity or tradition, but it's clear that people didn't have the luxury of choosing. They made do with what they had, adapting their lives to the reality of medieval times. And as much as we might cringe at the thought of sharing our bed with a goat, there's something oddly comforting about the simplicity of it all. No complicated gadgets, no high-maintenance sleep rituals, just people doing their best to stay warm and survive. By now, you're probably getting a sense of how different life was in the medieval world, especially when it comes to sleep. You've got people waking up in the middle of the night, checking on their livestock, praying, and even spending quality time with their partners, all while dealing with a lack of personal space and comfort. But there's more to this medieval sleep experience than just waking up for the occasional midnight snack or tending to your animals. If you think you've heard all the weird sleep habits, you're only scratching the surface. Let's dive into some of the bizarre sleeping conditions and traditions that made medieval sleep even stranger than we've already explored. First, let's talk about the bed itself. Now, the idea of a comfortable bed might seem like an oxymoron in the medieval world. Sure, you could have a bed with a wooden frame if you were wealthy. But don't get too excited. These luxurious beds were often drafty and lacked any form of cushioning beyond a thin mattress of straw or hay. In fact, many people slept on the floor with little more than a few blankets. This wasn't the soft, cushioned luxury of modern mattresses with memory foam or pillow tops. This was survival sleep. Even the wealthier folks who could afford a feather mattress weren't living the high life. Sure, they had more comfort than the poor, but their beds were still subject to the same cold drafts that made sleeping under a roof in medieval times more like a challenge than a comfort. And, much like their peasant counterparts, these wealthy folks had a battle on their hands with bedbugs, fleas, and lice. These pests were more than just an inconvenience. They were an integral part of medieval sleep life. In fact, lice were often so common that they became almost a symbol of the medieval experience. No one was safe from their relentless presence. Let's take a moment to think about the hygiene, or should I say, lack of hygiene, that played a role in this medieval sleep experience. The idea of personal cleanliness was radically different from what we think of today. Regular baths weren't part of everyday life. In fact, most people in the medieval period bathed only a few times a year, which is more than a little disturbing to imagine. What we might think of as basic hygiene was considered more of a luxury than a necessity. People didn't really scrub down with soap and hot water. Instead, they'd just wash their hands, face, and maybe a few other parts. But that was pretty much it. The rest of their body was often left to the mercy of whatever dirt and grime had accumulated over time. But it wasn't just about cleanliness. There were other practices people used to deal with. The unpleasant reality of sleeping in these environments. For example, many people wore nightcaps, not just to keep their heads warm, but also to prevent lice from getting into their hair. Not exactly the stuff of dreams, is it? But in the medieval world, this was the norm. On top of all this, people had to sleep in close proximity to family members, sometimes even sharing a straw pile with children, grandparents, and the occasional cousin who had come to visit. Privacy was a rare commodity, and the idea of having your own space to sleep was practically unheard of unless you were very wealthy. Even then, privacy wasn't guaranteed. It was common for families to share beds, not just for warmth, but out of necessity. And it wasn't just humans sleeping together. In fact, animals often slept in the same room, if not in the same bed. You might be surprised to learn that medieval homes were basically a communal living space where animals and humans coexisted in a haphazardly organized fashion. And here's something that might completely throw you off. Bed sharing was so normalized that people didn't even see it as unusual. In fact, it was common for strangers to share a bed at the local inn. When travelers arrived at an inn, they didn't just get a room to themselves. Instead, the innkeeper would give them a spot in a shared bed, often with complete strangers. Can you imagine that? After a long day of traveling, you're ready to rest. But instead of a quiet, peaceful sleep, you're trying to share space with someone you don't even know. What's more, it wasn't considered rude. In fact, it was just practical. The inns were overcrowded, and beds were in high demand. there was a space, you'd take it and hope that the other person didn't snore too loudly. So, what did people do to cope with this lack of privacy and comfort? They relied on their community. People were always surrounded by family members, neighbors, and the occasional guest. Even in the most private moments, like sleep, people learned to adapt to their surroundings. The medieval world wasn't about luxury. It was about getting by. Sleep, like every other part of life, was a matter of making do with what you had and surviving in a world that was often harsh, cold, and uncomfortable. Now, let's talk about the spirituality of sleep. In medieval times, sleep wasn't just about rest. It was about the soul. People believed that sleep was the moment when your soul could leave your body and wander. The idea of dreams was deeply rooted in spirituality, and many people thought that dreams were a reflection of their spiritual well-being. In fact, there were entire books written about the interpretation of dreams. If you had a dream about fire, it could mean that your soul was headed for hell. If you dreamed of water, it could mean purification. But dreams weren't always seen as simple psychological phenomena. They were often viewed as messages from the divine or the demonic. Historians still argue whether medieval people's interpretations of dreams were the result of superstition, or if they were genuinely tapping into something spiritual. But one thing's for sure: dreams and sleep were far from a trivial part of life. People believed their dreams were full of meaning, and so prayers before bed weren't just about comfort. They were about preparing your soul for whatever might happen during the night. Now, you're probably thinking that sleeping in medieval times couldn't possibly get weirder. After all, between segmented sleep, the bizarre nightcaps, and the cozy livestock companions, how could things possibly become more uncomfortable or strange? Well, let me tell you, there's always more. Medieval sleep wasn't just about cold stone walls or the occasional foot in your face from a goat. It was also about spiritual rituals, superstitions, and a whole lot of unpredictability. And yes, some of these weird sleep habits have roots that might shock you, considering the importance of sleep today. Let's talk about monastic sleep, specifically how monks and nuns slept in their monasteries. It wasn't just about getting rest after a long day of work or prayer. Oh no, monastic life was far more extreme. Imagine this: you've been working all day, chanting prayers, doing manual labor, and you finally get to your bed. But your bed isn't what you think it should be. No soft mattress, no down comforter, just a wooden plank and, if you're lucky, maybe a straw mattress to cushion you. The medieval monks were famous for their austere sleep habits, and the idea was that comfort was a distraction from spiritual discipline. Monks often slept on hard wooden planks. Not only that, but they had to sleep in complete silence and darkness, with a rigorous schedule that would make even the most disciplined person cringe. The idea was that sleep was not a time for comfort or relaxation. It was about discipline. In fact, they believed that sleeping in luxury could distract them from their religious duties. Pillows were non-existent, and the only real comfort they had was their spiritual practice. They would wake up in the middle of the night, perform prayers, and then go back to their discomfort, all in the name of holiness. It wasn't just about the physical discomfort either. Sleep deprivation was also seen as a form of spiritual purification. monks and nuns would rise in the dead of night, while most people were still nestled in their straw piles or hay mattresses, and would begin their prayers. This was mandatory. The sound of the bell ringing through the monastery at 2 a.m. was a sign to get up, regardless of how much rest they had. After all, monks weren't there to rest. They were there to serve God, and that service came in the form of daily chants, hours of prayer, and a highly regimented schedule that made sure they didn't sleep too much. You might wonder, why the harsh conditions? Well, the reasoning was simple. Suffering was seen as virtue. The less comfortable you were, the more spiritual merit you gained. This wasn't just about comfort or the lack of it. It was about discipline, control, and submission to God's will. The fact that a monk could sleep in such conditions, wake up, and function throughout the day without complaining was seen as a reflection of their deep faith. Of course, we can't talk about medieval sleep without mentioning the night prayers. As you've probably guessed, sleep in the Middle Ages wasn't just about turning off the lights and falling into dreamland. Before bed, people would pray. And sometimes, they'd even pray in the middle of the night, especially if they were concerned about their eternal soul. There were prayers for protection from evil, prayers for safe sleep, and even prayers to avoid nightmares. The medieval world was full of spiritual worries, and sleep wasn't exempt. People believed that demons roamed freely during the night, especially in the dark, and that the devil could invade your dreams or even take control of your soul while you slept. So, the best way to keep the devil away? Prayers before bed, often recited in unison by the family. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Anyone? But it wasn't just prayers. Medieval people had a whole arsenal of superstitions to protect themselves from evil while they slept. Some people slept with garlic under their pillow. Others placed iron charms or holy relics in their beds. Iron nails were often placed under the mattress to ward off evil spirits. They also believed that if you slept with your feet uncovered, you might be inviting the devil in, as he could easily slip into your bed and possess your body. There were specific rituals to ward off witches and protect oneself from bad dreams, including sprinkling holy water around the bed or sleeping with a crucifix by the pillow. But not all of these superstitions were solely about sleep. Some of them were simply social. If someone was seen sleeping alone, they could be thought of as strange or even suspect. A person who slept by themselves, especially a woman, was seen as vulnerable to temptation, and therefore, the act of sleeping together was often ritualized in a communal fashion to ward off loneliness, evil spirits, and even the possibility of moral decay. Families shared beds, strangers shared beds. Privacy wasn't a thing. Instead, survival came in numbers. Having a full house of sleepers was considered safer, and more importantly, morally proper. You might find yourself wondering about how sleepwalking fit into this medieval landscape. After all, sleepwalking today is usually written off as something that happens occasionally due to stress or sleep deprivation. But in medieval times, sleepwalking was seen as something far more sinister. It wasn't just about wandering around the house or accidentally tripping over a chair. It was about spiritual possession. The medieval world was so steeped in fear of the supernatural that if you sleepwalked, people might assume that your soul had temporarily left your body and that something demonic had taken its place. Exorcisms were performed on those who exhibited signs of nocturnal wandering, in the hopes of bringing the person's soul back to their body before it became too corrupted. Historians still argue whether sleepwalking was understood as a medical condition back then, or if it was genuinely seen as an indicator of spiritual problems. But one thing is for sure: medieval sleep was about far more than just resting. It was a time filled with rituals, superstitions, and in many cases, a fear of the unknown that seeped into every aspect of life, including the most basic human activity: sleep. By now, you're starting to get a pretty clear picture of medieval sleep. It wasn't just about getting rest after a long day. It was about survival, spirituality, and a whole lot of superstition. But there's one more thing you need to understand about medieval sleep: the way people lived through the night, not just the way they slept. And I'm not talking about simply surviving the cold or the discomfort of straw mattresses. I'm talking about the nighttime activities that kept people awake and active during the night hours. Let's start with the night watch. No, I'm not talking about that moment when you wake up to check your phone in the middle of the night. Although that's definitely a modern form of night watch. Back in the medieval world, there was actually a structured night watch that involved guarding the town or village during the hours when everyone else was asleep. Towns had a night watchman, and it wasn't just about keeping an eye on the perimeter. He was there to ensure that no one got up to no good during the night. You might think the medieval night watch was a safety measure against intruders or criminals, and you'd be right. But there was also another, equally important reason. The watchman had to be vigilant. People believed that evil spirits and demons would roam during the night, especially if the weather was bad or the atmosphere was thick with fog. The town watchman wasn't just there to stop burglars. He was also there to make sure evil didn't sneak into the village. And just like a nightcap could protect you from lice, the night watch was another layer of protection for the town. Though, of course, the protection wasn't always guaranteed. But the watchman's duties didn't stop there. His responsibilities extended to the nighttime rituals of the village, too. He was the one who would ring the town bell at the beginning of the night, signaling it was time to go to bed. And while that sounds like a quaint little ritual, it also had some deeper meanings. You see, the bell wasn't just an announcement of curfew. It was also a reminder that the night was a time for rest. However, it wasn't always about quieting things down. During the medieval period, especially in more rural areas, the nighttime was often louder than the day. The sounds of animals, the faint noise of activity, and sometimes even the clanging of metal from people working into the night were common. And no, this wasn't a coincidence. Medieval people worked late because their lives were so dependent on sunlight and the seasons that sometimes work couldn't stop, even at the darkest hours of the night. And for some, that meant taking part in nighttime feasts. You might be thinking, a feast? In the middle of the night? Who's going to eat dinner at midnight? Well, as it turns out, it wasn't so odd in the medieval period. While most people did eat their main meal during the daylight hours, feasts were common on special occasions, especially if there was a celebration or festival going on. But if you think of it in terms of our modern social lives, You can think of these events as a medieval version of night owls. When the main festivities were over, the people who stayed awake would often gather together to celebrate with food, music, and drink. Think about that for a second. You've spent the day working in the fields, toiling in the barn, and then, at night, you get a feast. The idea of nighttime feasting was, in many ways, a way to relieve the pressures of the day, but it was also tied to the rituals of community. During these gatherings, people didn't just eat. They often engaged in storytelling, games, and yes, even flirting. And while these late-night feasts might have been fun, they also were a time to observe social customs. The presence of alcohol during these events was just as much a part of the social fabric as the food itself. Drinking wasn't just about having a good time. It was also about camaraderie and community bonding. But not everyone was interested in feasting or working late. For some, the medieval night was a time for quiet solitude and reflection, especially for those who found themselves on the fringe of society. If you were an outsider, someone without a home, or even a widow, you probably spent your nights in solitary prayer or meditation, seeking protection or comfort from the hardships of life. Much like the monks in their austere cloisters, these people would often pray before bed, hoping for relief from the uncertainties of their lives. One key element of these medieval solitary nights was fear of the unknown. In many ways, medieval life was full of dangers, not just from outside threats, but from within. The idea of evil spirits taking over your body during the night was a serious concern. Whether it was fear of the devil, ghosts, or even a fear of dying in your sleep without being prepared, medieval people took their nighttime rituals seriously. If you weren't busy with a feast, work, or the night watch, you were likely praying, repenting, or performing some kind of spiritual ritual to protect yourself from whatever lurked in the shadows. Historians still argue whether these night rituals were born from true belief or from the fear of the unknown that characterized the medieval period. But what's clear is that the night was not just a time for sleep. It was a time of spiritual warfare, with people warding off evil, seeking solace, and hoping for protection. And those rituals didn't just end at dawn. Morning prayers were just as common as night ones, and they were often an extension of the efforts to keep evil at bay. And let's not forget about the nighttime economy. For some, the night was a time to make money. Night markets were common in medieval cities, where traders would sell goods by candlelight, hoping to catch the attention of late-night customers. These markets weren't just places to buy food or textiles. They were social hubs where you could meet people, exchange information, and strike deals. As we've seen so far, medieval sleep was far from ordinary. It was a time of rituals, spiritual reflection, and communal living, all woven together by superstitions and societal pressures. But we haven't even begun to touch on some of the most fascinating and, frankly, disturbing aspects of medieval sleep. So, hold on tight, because it's about to get a lot weirder. One of the most shocking things about medieval sleep is that privacy wasn't just limited in terms of space. It was also limited in terms of personal space. You may have imagined that a medieval village or town was full of close-knit communities, but that closeness didn't end with family or friends. In fact, it often extended to strangers. especially in places like inns or monasteries. Imagine, after a long day of travel or work, you climb into bed only to realize that someone else, a complete stranger, will be sleeping right next to you. Privacy was a luxury only available to the wealthiest, and even then, it didn't extend to the level we understand today. At an inn, for instance, guests often had to share beds, sometimes even with multiple people. The practice of bed sharing wasn't just for warmth, it was a matter of economy. It was too expensive to rent out an entire bed to just one person, and so, inns created a system where people would double up, or even triple up, in a bed. It wasn't uncommon for someone to have to share a bed with strangers, sometimes having no idea who they were. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, how could anyone sleep like that? Well, if you wanted to survive medieval times, you adapted. There wasn't much choice. Social norms and economic constraints made intimacy a shared experience. But the bed sharing didn't stop at inns. Families often shared beds as well. While this might sound a little more familiar, after all, people today sometimes co-sleep with children, the medieval concept of co-sleeping took it to a whole new level. People didn't just sleep with their children. They slept with extended family members and sometimes even random acquaintances. Bed sharing wasn't something people did out of choice. It was about practicality. Larger families, for example, often had no choice but to pile into the same space at night. To make matters worse, sleeping conditions weren't ideal. The quality of the bed, the mattresses, and even the room's atmosphere often left much to be desired. The experience of personal space was utterly foreign. You probably had no choice but to get used to the constant presence of others. But personal space wasn't the only issue in medieval sleep. There was also the terrifying prospect of spiritual danger. Superstition ruled the medieval mind, and as we've already discussed, nighttime was when evil spirits were believed to be at their most active. So, what's the first thing you do if you're convinced that spirits and demons could invade your body while you sleep? You pray. But medieval people didn't just pray in the evenings. They'd also pray in the middle of the night. And some of them took it to extremes. For example, people would often say specific nighttime prayers to protect their souls from demons. These prayers were a ritual, a form of protection that they believed could ward off spirits while they slept. And it wasn't just the rich who had the luxury of being blessed by the priest. Everyone had access to these prayers. Families would recite these prayers together in the hopes of keeping evil away and ensuring a good night's rest. But even with the prayers, there was still the possibility that spiritual forces could invade during the night. That's why medieval people believed that sleeping alone, especially women, was incredibly risky. Women, in particular, were vulnerable to temptation during the night. Evil spirits could take advantage of them while they slept, so sleeping together as a group, even if it wasn't ideal, was seen as the safest option. The fear didn't end with evil spirits either. There were superstitions about ghosts and demons that could invade your sleep, possessing you while you were unconscious. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, feeling uneasy, only to find out that the strange sensation was caused by the devil himself. Spirits were thought to roam free at night, and many people believed that they could even enter your body while you were in a deep sleep. The medieval mindset was constantly worried about being caught off guard, especially while unconscious. So prayers, amulets, and protective charms were essential to preventing spiritual invasion. But not everything about medieval sleep was purely based on fear and superstition. The idea of sleeping as a family unit wasn't just a response to evil spirits. It also had social benefits. In a world without much in the way of personal privacy, people didn't necessarily view sharing their sleeping space with others as negative. It was a way of staying connected, of forming stronger bonds, and providing emotional comfort to one another. Families shared warmth, space, and even protection in their tight quarters. Whether it was a parent comforting a child or an elderly relative watching over the younger ones, sharing a bed had benefits beyond survival. Despite the hardships, people didn't mind the lack of personal space in the same way we might today. Comfort wasn't expected, so sleeping arrangements were often fluid and adaptable. People made do with what they had, and there was an understanding that sleep wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. After all, the day's work had to be done, and everyone needed to rest together. Historians still argue whether sleeping together in close quarters helped form stronger family units, or if it was simply a matter of necessity. Whatever the case may be, medieval people didn't have the luxury of choosing their sleeping arrangements the way we do. Instead, they adapted to their surroundings, often making their sleep functional and community-oriented, both for protection and for survival. Now that we've talked about the hardships and supernatural fears that haunted medieval sleep, let's shift our focus to another fascinating aspect of the medieval night: the role of light and darkness. While today, we can control our sleep environment with dimmers, sleep masks, and blackout curtains, medieval people had no such luxuries. The medieval night was dictated entirely by natural light, which meant that once the sunset hit, night took on a completely different quality. For one thing, medieval people didn't have the luxury of electricity. Imagine, instead of turning off the lights before bed, you relied entirely on the fading light of a fire or a small candle, if you were lucky enough to afford one. Most people slept under the eerie quiet of natural darkness, the sound of the wind howling outside, the crackle of a fire somewhere in the village, the occasional hoot of an owl. All these sounds were part of the nightly symphony. Silence reigned, but it wasn't the peaceful, quiet kind we think of today. No, medieval silence was alive with uncertainty, with fears lurking in the shadows. At night, everything was obscured, and the lines between the real and the supernatural blurred. This isn't just the fear of being alone in the dark. It was a time when people thought that darkness wasn't just the absence of light, but a gateway for spirits, demons, and the wandering souls of the dead. If you were a medieval person, nighttime wasn't just time to sleep. It was a time for prayers and rituals to defend yourself from what could creep through the night. Take firelight, for example. This wasn't just for warmth or for cooking. It was a symbol of protection. In medieval homes, a fire was often kept burning in the hearth, not just to light the room, but because it was believed that fire would ward off evil spirits. People even hung herbs like garlic or rosemary above their doorways and around their beds, hoping to keep the devil or other dark forces at bay. If a flame flickered or a log cracked in the middle of the night, it wasn't just a sound. It could be a sign that something supernatural was stirring in the darkness. Historians still argue about the level of superstitions that influenced daily life. Was it just a coping mechanism? A way to deal with the unknown? Or did medieval people truly believe that demons and spirits lurked in the shadows of their homes? The fact that we even have records of these beliefs tells us that darkness in medieval times wasn't just a nuisance. It was something to be feared and respected. Now, let's talk about another important part of the medieval night: the sounds. In today's world, we have white noise machines, fans, and the hum of appliances that can lull us to sleep. But medieval people didn't have these comforts. Their nights were filled with the sounds of creaking wood, the rustling of animals, and the crackling of fires. But beyond that, the soundscape was also filled with the clatter of armor, the murmur of prayers, and perhaps most eerie of all, the echoing of church bells. The church bell wasn't just a marker for religious events. It was a signal, too. It rang not only to announce prayer times, but also to indicate that the night had begun, that it was time to rest. And yet, those bells could also signal something else. In some cases, the bell tolled for danger or death. When someone died in the village, the bell would toll. So, instead of the peaceful, comforting sound we think of today, the tolling of the bell might fill you with unease, because you knew it marked the passing of a person and the inevitable journey into the afterlife. If you were living in a fortified city or castle, night was even more perilous. If a siege was imminent or if raiders were nearby, the night watch would signal with a loud cry or a tolling bell to rouse the villagers to prepare for attack. The dark of night was not just a time for rest. It was also a time to be on alert, to be prepared for battle. People were on edge, not just because they were sleeping in uncomfortable conditions, but because the night itself was fraught with danger. But despite the fear, there were also moments of relief, like when the night watch was over, when you could finally lie down and sleep. But even then, sleep wasn't always restful. You had to be cautious. You had to sleep lightly, because no matter how safe you felt, there was always the possibility of being awakened by a bell ringing, a call to action, or perhaps the faint sound of footsteps that didn't belong to any of your family members. Let's talk about the sleeping position next. Because medieval people didn't just sleep lying flat on their backs like we do. In fact, sleeping upright was often preferred. A large part of medieval life was influenced by spiritual beliefs, and sleeping upright was seen as a way to keep the body in a proper alignment for spiritual purity. Sleeping on one's back, especially in a fully reclined position, was thought to resemble death, and death was something that had to be kept at arm's length, even while you slept. So, many people slept sitting up or in a semi-reclined position, especially during more formal times or in monasteries. Some even used wooden supports or bolsters to keep their bodies upright. Historians argue whether this position was purely for spiritual reasons or whether it had health benefits, like improving digestion. Some medical scholars of the time recommended this sleeping posture, suggesting that it would keep the body from being in the same position as the dead, or even to help with the balance of humors. Others saw it as just another way to deny comfort in favor of discipline. Whatever the reason, it was far from comfortable by modern standards. But these postures, these rules, all spoke to a deep understanding of the medieval worldview. They were constantly negotiating between survival, comfort, and spirituality. Their bodies were temples, but at the same time, they were susceptible to supernatural forces, disease, and even death. The night was just as much about ritual and preparedness as it was about rest. And as you can imagine, sleeping was just one small piece of the puzzle in an otherwise precarious world. Now that we've explored the deeper, more spiritual aspects of medieval sleep, let's delve into one of the most unexpected and practical aspects of how people slept: the medieval bed itself. While it's easy to imagine a life of constant discomfort, sleeping on straw piles, fighting for warmth in a crowded room, trying to avoid the cold night air, it's important to remember that even in these less than ideal conditions, people still sought to make their beds as comfortable as possible, given the circumstances. Take the bed frame, for instance. We often picture medieval beds as being little more than wooden planks or straw mattresses, and in some cases, that's true. But the wealthier classes had something slightly different in mind. They had large, wooden bed frames, often carved with intricate designs, where the mattress was elevated off the floor. This was primarily to keep the straw off the ground and to help with ventilation. But it also served a more social function. The higher your bed, the more prestigious you appeared. Nobles could afford luxurious bedding, with feather mattresses, embroidered sheets, and even canopies to shield them from the drafts and the insects that shared their living space. The higher class bed was a statement, an indication of status and wealth. But as you might have guessed, for peasants, comfort wasn't the priority. Beds for the lower classes were far simpler. Straw or hay-filled sacks would serve as the mattress, and they'd often sleep with their clothes on to stay warm. For these families, privacy was a distant concept. Whole families, sometimes extended families, would sleep on the same pallets or bed. Everyone was close. In the physical sense, certainly, but in other ways too. It was not uncommon for children to sleep with their parents, and generational co-sleeping was a norm rather than an anomaly. Now, you might be wondering, what about those nightmarish pests? Lice, bed bugs, and fleas were a constant presence in the medieval world, especially in beds. Medieval people lived in an environment where personal hygiene wasn't as highly prioritized as it is today. While the wealthy could afford privileged remedies, like night-picking services for their lice, the lower classes had to contend with the constant irritation of living in beds that hosted all sorts of insects. Straw-filled mattresses made for an ideal home for these pests. If you were a peasant, your bed was likely the perfect breeding ground for lice and fleas, which would keep you scratching and shifting throughout the night. Even the wealthy couldn't escape the horrors of bed bugs. The only real defense? Layers of linens or the occasional herbal remedy. It's reported that many people would hang garlic or other herbs by their bedposts to deter these pests. Some even slept with garlic cloves under their pillows, though I doubt that made for a peaceful night's sleep. Imagine the smell. But this constant battle with pests wasn't the only problem that came with medieval sleeping arrangements. There was also the matter of the temperature. As we've already discussed, medieval homes weren't equipped with modern heating systems. The idea of a central heater didn't exist. The only warmth in your home came from the fireplace, which, as you might guess, wasn't always conveniently close to your bed. It also wasn't uncommon for people to sleep with animals in their homes, which could help provide some much-needed warmth. Farm animals, particularly dogs, would often sleep at the foot of the bed, keeping your feet warm. Chickens and goats were often in the room too, though not for comfort. The livestock's primary function, in this case, was thermal regulation. If you lived in a cold climate, sharing space with your animals was practically a necessity. This wasn't out of affection for your animals, but a practical strategy for survival. With no central heating, the warmth of a dog or a goat was an essential commodity. Of course, this didn't come without its drawbacks. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, only to find that your goat has shifted in its sleep and is now tangled in your blankets. Or imagine the snoring of the animals, definitely a rude awakening. But for medieval people, this was the reality, and it was normal. You didn't have the luxury of choosing comfort over practicality. Historians still argue whether the presence of animals in medieval homes had more to do with survival or social symbolism. On one hand, animals provided warmth and company. On the other hand, they were also a sign of wealth. The more livestock you had in your home, the more resources you had access to. But whether it was practicality or symbolism, one thing is for certain. Living with animals was an integral part of medieval sleep culture. But no matter how cramped or uncomfortable your bed was, one thing was true. Once the lights went out, the medieval night became an entirely different world. The shadows would creep into the corners of the room, and with them, the ghosts, the spirits, and the demons. It wasn't just about sleeping. It was about surviving the night, guarding your soul, and hoping that the morning light would come to save you from the terrors of the darkness. Even today, when we talk about medieval sleep, it's easy to view it as a time of discomfort and fear. But in truth, it was also a time of resilience. People adapted, they survived, and they did it together, with what little they had. The medieval world was harsh, but it was also a world where community, spirituality, and even the smallest comforts mattered. As we continue our exploration of medieval sleep, let's turn our attention to something that many of us take for granted today: the concept of time and how it shaped the medieval sleep cycle. In the modern world, we have the luxury of easily tracking time through our smartphones, clocks, and even our own circadian rhythms that are synced to the 24-hour cycle of our day. But for medieval people, time was a much more ambiguous concept. The idea of a precise schedule was more about the sun's movement and less about minutes and hours. The lack of accurate timekeeping methods meant that medieval sleep was determined by the natural world. Most people woke up at the crack of dawn, thanks to the rising sun, and went to bed when the light faded, generally around sundown. The idea of a set, rigid sleep schedule as we know it today didn't exist. Medieval people simply slept when they could, and often in shifts. This means they experienced something known as segmented sleep, which is quite different from what we experience today. Segmented sleep was a common practice where people would sleep in two distinct parts during the night. Here's how it worked. You would first go to bed early in the evening and sleep for about 4 hours. After this first sleep, you'd wake up naturally, sometimes for as long as an hour or two. And then, once you were rested, you'd go back to sleep for the second half of the night. During this waking period, people would often pray, read, or perform household tasks like checking on animals or even socializing with neighbors. Historians still argue whether this two-part sleep was a natural sleep cycle that people adjusted to, or if it was a result of the lack of artificial lighting and the long, dark nights of the medieval period. Some scholars suggest that our modern, uninterrupted sleep cycle is an unnatural development brought on by the advent of electric lighting, while others believe that segmented sleep was simply a byproduct of the limitations of medieval technology. Either way, this practice of sleeping in two distinct periods was a significant part of medieval life, and it had a profound impact on how people interacted with both time and nightlife. Now, let's think about how this segmented sleep system would influence the daily routines of medieval people. Nighttime wasn't purely a time for rest, it was also a time to engage with the world around you. In a time without the distractions of smartphones, television, or artificial light, people were much more connected to the world around them during the night hours. There were no constant screen distractions to keep people awake. Instead, the night was a time to turn inward and reflect or connect with the spiritual realm. Midnight prayer, or prayers of protection during the hours between the first and second sleep, were not only spiritual practices, but were also cultural norms. One of the most fascinating aspects of this segmented sleep is that people often saw the waking period between sleeps as an opportunity to engage in activities that would be considered unusual by today's standards. For example, some people took this time to visit neighbors. Imagine stepping outside into the cold of the night, walking down the street to chat with a friend, or even visiting a family member who was working late. This concept of nighttime socializing was completely normal in the medieval period, and in many ways, it offered a form of community bonding that was impossible during the day. In the morning, after the second sleep, people would wake up at dawn, often feeling more rested than we would today, thanks to the natural interruption of the sleep cycle. However, this natural wake-up cycle didn't mean they had it easy. Medieval mornings were often filled with tasks, chores, feeding animals, and beginning daily labor before the sun got too high. The daily structure was heavily influenced by the seasons and the available daylight. In winter, people had much less light to work with, so their waking hours were shorter. In summer, the days were long, and people were awake for nearly the entire duration of daylight, maximizing the hours of light for work and other activities. But what about sleeping arrangements in these circumstances? As we've already seen, bed sharing was common, but it wasn't just for warmth or space efficiency. It was also a matter of social connection. A family unit or even a community often shared their sleeping arrangements. This sense of shared space was a way of bonding and providing each other with comfort during the dark hours. In some instances, it wasn't just the family sharing a bed. People who had no family or no home would find refuge in the homes of others. In a feudal society where survival was never guaranteed, social networks were integral to making it through the long, dark nights. Historians often debate whether this lack of personal space led to closer-knit communities, or if it created a sense of discomfort that medieval people simply learned to endure. On the one hand, communal sleeping meant a shared experience, which could bring a sense of protection and unity. On the other hand, sleeping in tight quarters with multiple people, including extended family members or even strangers, might have led to a lack of privacy that would be unimaginable in today's world. But personal space was only one part of the medieval sleep experience. The bigger question is, how did these sleep patterns affect health and well-being? With all the disruptions, the pests, the discomfort, and the constant communal nature of the medieval night, how did people manage to stay healthy? The fact that they did is a testament to human resilience. Now that we've explored the complexities of medieval sleep cycles and their communal nature, let's shift focus to something that might seem utterly foreign to us today: the nighttime activities that took place in the hours between first and second sleep. While modern folks might use this time to scroll through their phones, grab a midnight snack, or watch late-night TV, medieval people were far more practical with their waking hours. The time between the two sleep cycles wasn't just an annoying interruption for medieval people. It was an opportunity. Imagine waking up from your first sleep in the dead of night. What would you do? Would you toss and turn in the darkness, waiting to drift off again? Well, if you were a medieval person, you probably wouldn't be doing that. Instead, you might take the time to pray, check on your livestock, or even visit your neighbors. Yes, you read that right. People would socialize in the middle of the night. This practice of waking up for an hour or two in the middle of the night was not only normal, but expected. It was considered a time of spiritual reflection, as well as a time for personal connection. In fact, during this time, many people would perform spiritual rituals like prayers or devotions. Medieval monks and clergy were particularly known for their midnight prayers. It was believed that the hours between first and second sleep were when the soul was most vulnerable to evil spirits and demonic influence. So people would take extra precautions by performing rituals to protect themselves. But this wasn't just limited to religious folks. Even commoners, especially in rural areas, would use this time to engage in spiritual practices. It was a way to feel connected to something bigger than themselves. One particularly fascinating ritual was called the watch, where people would wake up and keep vigil, often in complete silence, for an hour or two. In some instances, the watch was a family event, with each member keeping quiet and praying or reflecting on their day. This was not an individual act of reflection, but a communal activity. The family, or even the local community, would share in this moment of introspection. Not only was this a time for spiritual protection, but it was also an opportunity to bond with loved ones and neighbors, creating a sense of shared experience and communal strength. Historians are still debating the social and psychological impact of such rituals. Was this just an effort to ward off evil spirits? Or was it a way of dealing with life's uncertainties? Some argue that the practice of waking up in the middle of the night for prayer or reflection was a coping mechanism for the stress of medieval life, filled with uncertainty, disease, and fear of death. Others believe that it was purely a spiritual act deeply tied to medieval religious convictions. Either way, it is clear that these rituals provided a way for people to manage the constant threat of supernatural forces while finding comfort in shared traditions. But not all medieval nighttime activities were spiritual in nature. There was, believe it or not, a fair bit of romance happening during the hours of segmented sleep. In fact, medieval physicians and marriage guides often suggested that the midnight wakefulness was the perfect time for intimacy between spouses. It was a time when both partners were rested, and the calmness of the hour was thought to be conducive to closeness. Let's face it, given the fact that privacy was limited, finding a time for quiet and intimacy could be quite a challenge. Now, you might be thinking, why was that the best time for intimacy? It turns out that medieval people believed that physical closeness in the middle of the night could create a special bond. After all, your partner was probably the only other person in your tiny bed. So, while many people used their second sleep to catch up on rest, others found the night to be the perfect time for a little romantic connection. It's interesting to think that while modern society often prioritizes privacy and independence, medieval people found community and togetherness in their sleeping arrangements, even during intimate moments. It's also worth noting that medieval life was filled with hardships, sickness, famine, war. So the opportunity for connection during these vulnerable moments likely played a role in maintaining a sense of emotional security. In many ways, it was an act of resilience, finding comfort in each other despite the harsh realities of the world. Of course, medieval communities were not just about family and spirituality. The hours between first and second sleep also created a unique opportunity for socialization. People would often leave their homes and visit neighbors during these midnight hours. This wasn't just to talk about the weather or swap gossip. It was a time for people to check on each other, especially in rural areas where there wasn't always a clear sense of social order. These nighttime visits weren't only about hospitality or kindness, they were also about community survival. Medieval communities were tightly knit, but they were also full of competition and survival struggles. These nighttime gatherings were a way to foster trust and ensure that everyone was surviving the difficulties of medieval life. It was important to check in on your neighbors, especially in communities where resources were limited. Sharing food, information, and emotional support could make a huge difference in these tough times, and the night was the time to do it. When the day's work was over, and people had a little space to focus on each other. Historians are still uncertain whether this nighttime socializing was strictly necessary, or if it was simply a cultural preference. Some argue that it was a practical response to the darkness and quiet, while others believe it was driven by a deep-seated need for connection in a world that was often unpredictable and dangerous. Regardless of the cause, the fact remains that medieval people found ways to adapt to their world, turning even the middle of the night into an opportunity for connection, spiritual reflection, and romantic bonding. As we now venture deeper into the intricacies of medieval nightlife, let's take a moment to examine something that seems oddly modern in its essence: the impact of sleep deprivation and how medieval people dealt with it. Today, we are increasingly aware of the dangers of too little sleep, with countless studies showing how sleep deprivation can lead to health problems, from mental fatigue to chronic illness. In medieval times, however, the concept of sleep deprivation wasn't so much a medical issue. It was a fact of life. Think about it. With no artificial light, Nighttime was a shared experience. It was a natural cycle. When night fell, everyone rested, and when the morning came, everyone woke. Sleep deprivation wasn't the result of binge-watching TV shows or spending hours on social media. It was often a result of survival and the need to keep working after hours, especially in rural villages, where everyone had to contribute to the household economy. In a society where work was endless and resources were scarce, people often worked late into the night, sometimes until the second sleep cycle, especially during harvest time or busy seasons. Sleep, as we now understand it, became a luxury. As we explored earlier, segmented sleep was a major feature of medieval life, which meant that people naturally experienced periods of wakefulness throughout the night. For some, this wasn't just about praying or socializing. It was about getting things done. There were tasks to attend to. You could check on the livestock, maybe even make repairs to your tools, or prepare food for the coming day. The night wasn't just a time for rest. It was another opportunity for productivity, which often came at the cost of a full night's sleep. This brings us to the question of how medieval people actually managed to cope with sleep deprivation. Let's face it, the medieval world was exhausting, and being tired was part of daily life. So, what did people do when they were clearly fatigued from the long hours of work and interrupted sleep? Social bonds came into play in remarkable ways. When you're sleep-deprived and working through the night, you need strength and emotional support. You find it in your neighbors, your friends, and especially your family. This is where shared meals, rituals, and community prayer took on an even greater significance. Rituals weren't just about religion. They were about building a collective sense of resilience. For example, people might have gathered together for a midnight feast, or joined in a prayer session to bolster their strength and fortitude. The act of joining together for these rituals was not only about spiritual defense, as we discussed before, but also about togetherness in the face of exhaustion. Interestingly, many medieval texts and manuscripts actually discuss the importance of managing fatigue, especially in the context of spirituality. Some monks and clergy were known for their night vigils, awake through the night for spiritual purposes. But despite their deep devotion, these long hours were not always beneficial for their physical well-being. Historians argue that the lack of sleep could have been one of the reasons why medieval people, especially religious figures, experienced higher rates of disease and shorter life expectancies. Yet, despite the physical toll, the spiritual benefits of these nightly practices were often seen as paramount. For medieval people, spiritual protection and soul care outweighed concerns about physical exhaustion. To them, sleep deprivation wasn't a choice. It was just the way things were. You might be tired, but the spiritual and communal benefits of these rituals outweighed the cost of a few hours lost to sleep. On top of this, medieval diets also played a role in how people coped with fatigue. While we might think of heavy meals today as being the enemy of good sleep, for medieval people, hearty foods like stews or pottage were staples of their diet. These were typically rich in starches, which helped to fuel people through their long days and nights. If you were working the fields or taking care of animals, the idea was to keep your body going on sustained energy. There was no quick caffeine boost or energy bar to help get you through the night. Food sleep, and faith were the only tools available. Alcohol also played a pivotal role in medieval nightlife, but it wasn't quite the kind of alcohol we think of today. Mead, beer, and wine were commonly consumed, not just for socialization, but as a way to relax and perhaps even numb the body after long, exhausting days. In fact, alcohol was often safer to drink than water, which could be contaminated. Drinking at night, especially during the midnight wakefulness, was a common social activity. People would drink together to create a sense of solidarity and comfort while fighting off the physical toll of their work. But alcohol wasn't the only tool medieval people used to cope with their exhaustion. They also relied heavily on herbal remedies to rejuvenate themselves. While today, we might turn to vitamins or over-the-counter stimulants, medieval people often brewed their own tonics using ingredients like ginseng, sage, and even peppermint to help stimulate their bodies and minds during these long hours. These remedies weren't a cure-all, but they served as important tools for handling the stress and exhaustion of medieval life. Historians continue to debate how effective these remedies were and whether they provided any real relief. Was it simply the placebo effect, or did these herbs have genuine medicinal value? Regardless of the answer, herbalism was a huge part of medieval life. The belief in natural remedies was deeply embedded in medieval culture, and it played a major role in the survival strategies of everyday people. Having explored the strategies medieval people used to cope with exhaustion and manage their sleep, let's now examine another integral part of the medieval sleep experience: the often ignored but highly significant impact of dreams on daily life. Dreams in medieval times were far more than just random images or fanciful imaginings. They were seen as a profound, divinely inspired phenomenon, often interpreted as messages from God, warnings of danger, or visions of the future. The way people viewed and responded to their dreams shows us just how deeply medieval society was influenced by spirituality, superstition, and the religious norms of the time. Medieval dream interpretation was not something left to the scientific mind. It was the domain of priests, monks, and other spiritual leaders. The church held great sway over how people viewed not only their waking lives, but also their dreams. In fact, dreams were often seen as a direct connection to the spiritual realm, with God, saints, and angels using dreams to guide or punish the faithful. Medieval people didn't just shrug off a weird dream. They took it to heart and sought out an interpretation that could change the course of their lives. Let's take a look at one of the more common interpretations of medieval dreams: the fear of demons. Many medieval people believed that dreams of monsters, devils, or nightmares were not just figments of imagination, but actual demonic visits meant to tempt or test their faith. In this context, the medieval mind treated the night as a realm of constant danger, where dreams could blur the line between earthly reality and supernatural influence. Visions of hellfire, fiery landscapes, and tormented souls were not only terrifying, they were also signs of spiritual peril, indicating that the dreamer was either at risk of sin or under spiritual attack. What's truly fascinating is how these demonic dreams were sometimes seen as warnings. Dreams of death, ghostly figures, or foreboding symbols were often interpreted as signs that someone in the community was about to die, or that the dreamer needed to repent for some sin they had committed. There are even records of medieval dreamers who, after having particularly vivid or terrifying nightmares, would seek out confession or penance to cleanse their souls. Dream interpretation, thus, was not just a means of spiritual guidance, but also a way to maintain social order. People used dreams as a barometer for their spiritual health, and any unsettling dream could prompt a search for moral clarity. Historians still debate whether these beliefs were based on genuine psychological phenomena or were simply cultural fabrications. Were medieval people really more susceptible to sleep disturbances and nightmares due to their harsh living conditions? Or were these dreams entirely shaped by the religious atmosphere? Either way, it's clear that dreams in the medieval period were far from insignificant. They held the power to shape decisions, guide behavior, and even influence life choices. It wasn't just bad dreams that held significance. Good dreams, too, were seen as divine messages. If someone dreamed of angels, saints, or blessed visions, it was considered a divine blessing, a sign that God was watching over them. These dreams often led to spiritual affirmation and a sense of being protected. The influence of these dreams wasn't just personal, it affected entire communities. Church leaders would often interpret dreams on behalf of the public, and those dreams could help steer the entire course of a village's or town's actions. For example, a community might believe that a dream of an angel urging them to pray would result in a bounty of crops, or a dream of a saint's vision would ensure the town's protection from disease. Dream books and dream interpreters were also quite popular during the medieval period. These books contained lists of dream symbols and their meanings. If you dreamed of a snake, it might indicate that you had been seduced by temptation, while dreaming of a flower might symbolize spiritual growth or even romantic love. People would keep these books close by, referring to them to interpret their dreams after they woke up. For those without access to such books, local clergy or town elders often acted as dream interpreters, offering guidance on how to proceed based on the meanings of their nocturnal experiences. One curious aspect of medieval dream interpretation was the degree to which sex played a role in their meaning. It's not surprising to hear that dreams of intimacy were often linked with spiritual conflict. Medieval religious authorities frequently advised against indulging in sexual fantasies and dreams, as they were thought to be sinful or the result of demonic influence. Dreams involving intimacy between married couples were seen as spiritually neutral, but those involving extramarital affairs or sexual sin were interpreted as evidence that a person was falling into temptation or had strayed from God's path. Medieval people weren't just concerned with morality during the day. Their nighttime actions, even if only in dreams, were also seen as moral tests. And if you thought dreams were personal affairs, think again. Shared dreams, especially among family members or communities, were sometimes seen as divinely orchestrated and meant to communicate messages or warnings. If multiple people in a village had the same dream, it was believed that something important was being foretold. In fact, mass dreams could lead to entire public movements or rituals in response. If a village dreamt of a harbinger of death, the entire community would sometimes prepare for disaster, whether that was famine, plague, or war. Historians are still trying to fully understand how much of this dream culture was based on actual psychological states or if it was purely a cultural and spiritual construct. Could medieval people have suffered from night terrors or sleep paralysis? Conditions that we now know are linked to stress and sleep deprivation? Or were these dreams genuinely spiritual messages from another realm? Now that we've discussed the deeply spiritual and cultural significance of dreams in medieval life, it's time to turn our attention to a very practical element of the medieval night: sleeping arrangements. The state of a medieval bed, whether it was for a noble or a peasant, speaks volumes about the differences in social classes, the lifestyle of the time, and even the health of the people who used them. If you think about it, sleep was a luxury for some, but it was a necessity for everyone. However, how people experienced it was far from comfortable. First, let's take a look at the noble class and their beds. Now, if you imagine a medieval bed, you might think of something grand and majestic, perhaps with a canopy and embroidered sheets. While this is true for the wealthy, beds for the elite were often large, elaborate, and in some cases, very ornate. Nobles had feather mattresses, often stuffed with the finest down from geese or ducks, a step up from the rough straw used by commoners. In fact, a feather mattress was so highly valued that it was often passed down as an inheritance, like an heirloom piece. When a noble died, it was often their bed that became the most treasured item in their will. The more decorated the bed, the more wealth and status it represented. But let's not get too carried away thinking that these beds were luxurious. Sure, they were more comfortable than straw mats, but they were still hard by modern standards. The pillows were stuffed with feathers, hay, or wool, which meant they were often lumpy and could have uncomfortable lumps poking into your neck throughout the night. Furthermore, the bed frames were often made of wood, which was heavy and creaky. There wasn't the modern convenience of memory foam or even box springs. Yet, for those wealthy enough to have their own beds, their nightly rest was undoubtedly much better than that of their poorer counterparts. Now, for the common folk, the experience was far more humble and often uncomfortable. Most peasants slept on straw mattresses or pallets, which were often filled with whatever they could find: straw, hay, or rushes, and stuffed into rough cloth sacks. If you didn't even have that luxury, you slept directly on the floor, which, depending on the season, could be damp, cold, and inhospitable. The nobles' beds might have been passed down as precious heirlooms, but for peasants, a bed wasn't something passed down in the family. It was a simple tool for survival. And if you think about how this affects sleep quality, the physical discomfort of the medieval sleeping environment must have been unbearable at times. The beds were infested with bugs, lice, fleas, and even bed bugs. This meant that the act of sleeping wasn't just about resting. It was a battle against itching, scratching, and the ever-present fear of pests nibbling away at you throughout the night. If you were lucky enough to have a straw mattress, it could harbor insects. And if it was damp, which, let's face it, it probably was, it might also smell like mold. Imagine trying to sleep in that. Probably not very restful. In fact, hygiene in the medieval period was nothing like what we think of today. People didn't take daily showers or baths, and even if they did, there wasn't the luxury of modern soap or clean water. People, especially the lower classes, didn't just sleep on uncomfortable beds. They slept on beds that were dirtied by animal feces sweat, and filth. So while we might think of our sleep environment as a sanctuary where we go to escape the world, for medieval people, their sleeping arrangements were simply another part of their daily struggle. But it's not all bad news when we look at the sleeping arrangements of the wealthy. While the elite may have had better beds, they still suffered from similar challenges. Even nobles slept in drafty castles where cold air blew in through stone walls and open windows. They were also vulnerable to pests and bugs, just like the peasants. In fact, nobles often had to sleep in separate rooms or cavernous halls, which meant that warmth was at a premium. This was why nightcaps, headdresses, and warm woolen blankets were so important. Despite the perceived luxury, the wealthiest individuals still had to contend with the elements and the discomfort that came with medieval living. Let's not forget the communal aspect of medieval sleep. Families often slept together, not just for warmth, but for safety. There were no private rooms as we know them today. Children, parents, and even grandparents might share the same space, and it wasn't unusual for several people to sleep on a single mattress or straw pile. This communal sleeping arrangement was an essential part of medieval life, especially in rural areas where privacy was often unavailable. And if you think sleeping in the same bed with your extended family might sound uncomfortable, well, you're not alone. Imagine trying to get a good night's rest with multiple bodies in one cramped space. In fact, there was very little privacy in medieval life. But despite all the discomfort, this communal sleeping arrangement also reinforced social bonds. Family members and villagers were literally sleeping together every night, which likely helped them survive the hardships of medieval life. Historians are still debating the exact psychological effects of these shared living and sleeping arrangements. Did they promote a sense of closeness and community, or were they just a result of necessity? Some argue that these shared spaces were a cultural feature that emphasized the importance of family and unity, while others suggest that the lack of privacy could have led to psychological strain or resentment. Either way, it's clear that medieval sleep was a very different experience from our modern version, filled with practical challenges, but also offering a sense of community and shared survival. As we arrive at the final chapter of our medieval sleep exploration, we need to examine one more facet of the medieval sleeping experience that tied everything together: the intricate relationship between spirituality, sleep, and the idea of death. Medieval society was steeped in a pervasive belief that sleep wasn't just a physical state, it was an emotional and spiritual journey. People didn't just sleep to rest. They slept with the constant awareness that death could strike at any moment. This sense of existential vulnerability permeated every aspect of life, especially in relation to how people prepared for sleep at night. Unlike our modern perception of sleep as a daily necessity, in the medieval world, sleep was often viewed as a rehearsal for death. The idea of going to bed each night was linked with the possibility that you might not wake up. In a time when illness, disease, and violence were ever-present threats, going to bed wasn't just about resting your body. It was a spiritual act of preparation. People would go to sleep in a state of spiritual readiness, prepared for the possibility that they might never see the dawn. To protect themselves from spiritual harm, Many medieval people would engage in rituals before sleep. One of the most common practices was to say prayers before bed. This wasn't just a tradition. It was seen as an act of purification. By praying before sleep, people believed they were ensuring spiritual protection through the night. The famous prayer, "Now I lay me down to sleep," is rooted in this medieval belief that sleep was an opportunity to prepare the soul for whatever might come next. The prayer itself is a request for protection, acknowledging that sleep, for all its comfort, could also be a dangerous journey for the unprepared. This link between sleep and death was reinforced by religious doctrine, which taught that the moment of death was just as significant as the moment of birth. Monks and clergy in particular took this very seriously, and many of them would sleep in a state of constant spiritual vigilance. Some monks even practiced a form of sleeping upright, avoiding luxury and comfort to ensure that their minds and souls remained vigilant. For these religious individuals, the line between sleep and death was thin, and it was essential that they be spiritually prepared for both. In rural communities, where death and disease often struck without warning, the idea of sleep as a form of spiritual preparation was even more pronounced. In many instances, people would sleep in groups, perhaps to ensure that if one of them died in their sleep, the others would be there to pray for their soul. This practice of communal sleep wasn't just about warmth or safety. It was also about ensuring a communal passage to the afterlife. But what happens when we consider death during sleep in the broader context of medieval beliefs? It was common for people to consider dying in their sleep as a blessing or a grace. In a time of constant war, plague, and poverty, a peaceful death, free from suffering, was viewed as the ideal end. People would often pray that they would die in their sleep, surrounded by loved ones, peacefully and without pain. This belief was so ingrained that for many, going to sleep was a form of surrender, a final act of trust in God's will. The fear of death in sleep was especially pronounced in older people, who often prepared for death by organizing their affairs, praying for forgiveness, and gathering their family members around them. For these individuals, sleep was often a time of reflection on their life's deeds, as well as a chance to reconcile with God. Medieval texts are full of stories of people who made a final confession or said their last prayers before going to sleep, knowing that they might not wake up. For many, these last acts were seen as the only safeguard against the afterlife, a way to ensure that their souls were ready for what lay beyond. In addition to prayers, physical symbols of spiritual protection were commonly kept by the bed, such as holy relics, crucifixes, or sacred texts. People believed that these objects provided divine shielding against evil spirits that might invade their dreams or their sleep. Some even slept with amulets or charms made of holy materials, convinced that these objects had the power to keep them safe from harm and guide their souls to heaven. Another fascinating aspect of this interplay between sleep and death was the medieval belief in sleep as a dream state of prophecy. If someone had a dream of death, they were often believed to have received a divine warning. In this way, dreams and sleep weren't just seen as random occurrences. They were spiritual events that could reveal deeper truths about the individual's fate. For example, if a person dreamed of themselves lying in a coffin, it was often interpreted as a warning that death was near. In some cases, People would even prepare for death after such dreams, making arrangements for their funeral or giving away possessions. Of course, these ideas also played into medieval ideas about social order and the inevitability of fate. People were taught to accept death, and sleep was often the last reminder that life was fragile and unpredictable. As historians have pointed out, medieval people lived in a world where life expectancy was short, and death was a constant presence. This sense of inevitability made people all the more likely to view sleep not just as a physical necessity, but as a spiritual act of surrender to the divine order. By understanding how the medieval worldview intertwined sleep with death, we can better appreciate the depth of their connection to the spiritual realm. For them, sleep wasn't just a time for rest. It was a ritual, a transition, and a spiritual act that reminded them of their place in the grand, mysterious order of life and death. As we wrap up our journey through the medieval night, we find ourselves at the crossroads of tradition, superstition, and the unknown. The lives of those who lived long before us may seem quaint and almost impossible to understand, but one thing remains clear. Their sleep, just like ours, was central to their survival and well-being, albeit under vastly different circumstances. Now, as we step away from the dark and sometimes eerie world of medieval rest, let's reflect on how much has changed and how much has stayed the same. In the modern world, we tend to think of sleep as a time for restoration, a time for the body and mind to recover from the daily grind. We rely on science, technology, and even sleep trackers to optimize our rest. We have sleep studies, medications, and therapies that aim to help us sleep better, longer, and more peacefully. But what if we could take a page from medieval sleep and think of sleep not just as rest, but as an experience? The rituals, the spirituality, and even the challenges of medieval sleep offer us a unique perspective on how sleep can serve as more than just a biological necessity. It can be a time of introspection, preparation, and self-awareness. Modern society, with all of its technological advancements, often feels disconnected from the natural rhythms of life. Electric lights, 24/7 access to information, and the pervasive reach of social media have left us wide awake at all hours, with our minds racing and our bodies tired. How many of us have felt the discomfort of sleeplessness after binge-watching our favorite shows or scrolling endlessly on our phones? We may joke about being exhausted, but in many ways, we have lost touch with the natural aspects of sleep that were so deeply ingrained in medieval life. In a world filled with distractions, we've forgotten the spiritual side of sleep, the sacredness of rest, and the profound connection between night and the soul. So, what can we learn from the medieval experience? For starters, we can begin by reclaiming sleep as a spiritual practice. The idea that sleep was more than just a biological process, but rather a time of spiritual reflection and preparation for death, is something that can add deeper meaning to our lives today. What if we allowed ourselves to see sleep as a time for growth, for prayer, for reflection, or for simply being more present in the moment before drifting off to rest? This is something that medieval people understood deeply. They saw their time spent in sleep as an opportunity to connect with the divine, to align themselves with higher powers, and to prepare for the unknown. Think about the practice of meditative sleep. a practice that is only recently beginning to be explored in the modern world. People today are beginning to understand that mindfulness and meditation can be powerful tools to improve the quality of sleep, allowing us to reconnect with our inner selves in ways that we might have forgotten. Could it be that the medieval rituals, from night prayers to spiritual reflections, were a precursor to modern techniques of mindful relaxation? Perhaps the medieval bedtimes were not as uncomfortable as we thought, but rather a symbol of the peace and preparedness that people were striving to attain, both in this life and the next. On a more practical level, we can also learn from the medieval methods of coping with exhaustion. In a world where work and responsibilities pull us in countless directions, many of us are left struggling to keep up. The medieval world was one of hard labor, where physical exhaustion was a daily fact of life. People had to make do with minimal rest, yet they found strength through community, rituals, and a sense of purpose that kept them moving forward. Perhaps we too can learn from their resilience, finding strength not just in rest, but in how we approach our daily tasks. Could the modern world benefit from a community-oriented approach to rest, where we prioritize our relationships with others and support one another through challenges, much like the medieval villagers did? Moreover, as we reflect on medieval sleep, it's impossible to ignore the impact of fear and uncertainty in shaping the nightly experiences of the people. Fear of death, fear of the unknown, and fear of the darkness were pervasive in their sleep rituals. Yet, despite these fears, medieval people didn't shy away from the night. They faced it head-on with prayer, courage, and community. In this light, modern society has much to gain from reconnecting with the courageous spirit of medieval people, who bravely navigated the uncertainties of life, even in their sleep. In conclusion, the medieval experience of sleep offers us a valuable perspective on how we can approach our own rest, our spiritual lives, and our sense of community. While we've come a long way in terms of comfort, convenience, and scientific understanding, there's something to be said about the ritualistic and spiritual aspects of sleep that medieval people held dear. In learning from their practices, we may discover ways to make our own sleep not just a time of physical rest, but a time for spiritual renewal, reflection, and reconnection. Perhaps next time we close our eyes, we should do so with a deeper understanding, not just of the rest we need, but the peace we long for.